I have a large family, which in the world of pensions is a pretty good thing, right? The demographics of how many workers support how many people in old age. I actually have 9 children. So, and one of them happens to have her own startup here in the state of Texas. So somebody's going to be supporting me in old age because pensions need the right demographics to really work. But many, many years ago, my wife was out at a coffee shop with our oldest son named Egan. And Egan was starting to misbehave. And whatever he was doing, my wife said, Egan, I want you to stop that. Well, whatever it was, he did it again. She said, I told you to stop that. And he did it again. She said, Egan, if you do that again, we're leaving. Well, whatever it was. He did it again. She said, all right, we're leaving. You know, we're going to go. I told you to stop it. You didn't stop it. He said, but I don't want to go. I don't want to go. And she said, well, that's too bad. I told you if you kept doing that, we were going to leave. You kept on doing it. So now you have to live with the consequences. And he said, I don't want to live with the consequences. I want to live with you. So one of the things that we're going to talk about today is the consequences of the demise of the DB plan in the private sector and the tremendous importance of the maintenance and protection of DB plans in the public sector. So I'm going to go through a few different points, including in particular the power of defined benefit plans. If you think about how significant the returns can be in a defined benefit plan and how much people depend upon the reliable income in a defined benefit pension plan, it's a tremendous trust. And I know many of the people in this room are trustees, and that's the right word, because you really hold in your hands the future income of thousands and probably all in, you know, millions of Texans. And the demise of the defined benefit plan in the corporate world has been tremendous. Today, there's many, many more public employees have defined benefit plans than corporate sector employees, and the ratio is only getting worse. So you have a real public trust in maintaining and defining and protecting and advocating for public sector pension plans. Now, there's a lot of differences. I know you had a speaker yesterday who talked about the differences between private sector and public sector pension plans, but it's really important, I think, to focus on why they have different funding ratios, why they have different investment policies. So first of all, you're probably all familiar with LDI, liability-driven investing. Why does a corporate plan do liability-driven investing? It's because the value of their liabilities goes up and down with interest rates, right? Most of your plans have fixed interest rates to measure the value of your liabilities. In the corporate world, as interest rates go up and down, your liabilities correspondingly go down and up. So now you're the CFO, or you're the CIO, and you come to the CFO and you say, hey, I got great news. Last year, you put in $100 million, and I got a return of 9.5%, which is is half a percentage point better than my peers. I did great. And the CFO says, well, that's fine, but interest rates dropped, so the value of our liabilities has gone up so much that I have to put in $150 million this year. And that's why corporate plans have moved away from defined benefit plans. In addition, not only do I have to put in 150 next year, I don't know what's going to happen the year after and the year after. So what does that affect? That affects my cash flow. That affects my earnings. That affects my price-earnings ratio. That affects my stock price. That affects my compensation. So public plans, obviously, it's obvious, but it's a really important point. You don't have a stock price, right? You don't have a price-earnings ratio. I mean, there are ways to measure government effectiveness, but you're not subject to the vicissitudes of the marketplace changing the value of your liabilities on a moment's notice. That's a tremendously important point. Another important point is that corporate plans are often thinking they might be a target of an acquisition. Well, last I looked, other than through war, governments don't do M&A. So you're not really having to make sure that your plan is properly funded so that someone can take over the municipality or the county that you represent. In addition, a corporate plan can file for bankruptcy. So there's a whole different approach there. You could say, since we are having corporate trouble, we're going to depend upon the PBGC as a bailout, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corp, which I ran many years ago. There's no bailout for public plans. So, you know, the stakes are very, very high. You can't file bankruptcy. You can't depend upon another government entity to bail you out. So the power of a defined benefit plan versus a defined contribution plan is enormous. So the pooling that comes from just simply having the same assets in the same pool, right away you have scale. So when you think about a defined contribution plan and each individual is investing on his or her own, the fee scale is tremendously different. So just the fees alone are a huge saving in a defined benefit plan versus a defined contribution plan. But then there's also investment expertise. How many of your participants, if they were only in a DC plan, would you think are sophisticated enough to really understand discount rates and proper diversification and how much allocation they should have to CLOs or emerging market debt? It's just not really in the backgrounds of most employees in most companies in the world. So when you have pooling, you have a pool of funds that is managed, as you oversee, by professional managers who have access to data and resources and investment managers that a typical DC plan just doesn't have. You also pool longevity risk, and that's probably the most important point of all, right? When you're an individual and you're on your own, if you have thought about your life expectancy, you have figured that you need to invest as though you're going to live to be 100, because there's nobody whose longevity is going to bail you out because they're going to die earlier. But in a DB plan, what really happens is the people who die early subsidize the people who die later. And so the DB CIO and team can invest with a target date of, let's just say, 85 years old, because the people who live to 95 will benefit from the people who died at 75. That's a hugely, hugely powerful aspect of defined benefit plans. It's also become very well understood in England and in the Netherlands, where they have what they call collective defined contribution plans. There's not actually a guarantee, but they are operated like a DB plan, and they pool the asset management, they pool the longevity risk, et cetera. DB plans also protect against sequence of payments risk. Now that's a pretty obscure title for a pretty understandable risk. The risk is, oh no, the market just went down 20% and I was going to retire this year. That's what sequence of returns risk is. It's the, oh shit, how did I get into this situation risk? And when you're in a DB plan, the CIO isn't thinking about, okay, you are retiring now, so you're going to get less. The CIO and team, they're thinking about 20 and 30-year time horizons. So the little blip in the fact that right now things have just gone down, you don't lock in, right? If you start to say, let's say you went to buy an annuity. You had $1 million and you decided to buy an annuity, except just before you bought it, the market went down to 800,000. It went down 20%. Suddenly your annuity is going to be worth 20% less than it would otherwise be. But your pension is not going to be worth 20% less because the investment team is focused on the long term and not on locking you in the moment when you turn into having an income stream. And similarly, if you are on your own, you're going to de-risk over time. In a target date fund, for example, you de-risk over time. You might be 90% equities when you're 25, and you might be only 30% equities when you're 65. You've begun to de-risk. In de-risking, you've decreased the chance of having high returns. You could still have high returns, but you certainly have mitigated risk, but you've also decreased the upside. Well, in a DB plan, nobody's de-risking as you get older because they're still investing for the long term for the people behind you who are 25 and 35 years old. Hugely powerful. So those benefits of pooling are something that you should all be really steeped in, because there are states, Florida had a bill that passed the state Senate to stop having DB plans. It wasn't going to take away any that were already in place, but it was going to take away DB plans for the future. Florida is a pretty significant, large, sophisticated state, and one of their houses actually passed a bill that would have done that. The bill didn't ultimately become law, but you should be very well steeped in these kinds of benefits of DB plans. I can send this study to anybody who wants it. The fact of the matter is it actually costs less to fund a DB plan than a DC plan for some of the same reasons that I just spoke about. The difference is, going back to the corporate side, a DC plan is less volatile. The corporate plan knows I'm going to put in 4% a year, and after that, whatever happens to the liabilities, whatever happens to interest rates, I'm not on the hook. So that's one of the reasons that corporate plans do that. But when you stop and realize that the power of pooling also makes a DB plan actually less expensive than a DC plan, that's a pretty important point. So this is a slide that I love, and it summarizes, again, the DC versus DB world. So when you are a participant in a DB plan, you depend upon an investment staff, you depend upon a risk actuary, you depend upon compliance officers, you depend upon an outsourced investment management team. You have people who are picking the best investment managers, sophisticated investment policies that are reviewed every 2 or 3 years. When you're in a DC plan, you're on your own. You are the CIO. You are the risk manager. You are the pension actuary. You are the person who has to guess to what age, how long am I going to live, or how long should I plan to live? How should my assets be allocated against those kinds of risks? And most people just simply aren't prepared to do that. And because of this fact, a lot of DC plans are now focusing on including lifetime income options in their DC plan. Are you in this room familiar with the Secure Act? How many people are familiar with the Secure Act? So about 3 years ago, Congress passed a law encouraging the use of lifetime income solutions, annuities, inside defined contribution plans, in particular 401ks, but also 457 plans and some other ones that you might be familiar with. And some government plans are DC only. Some government plans, as I'm sure you know, have some aspects of DC to them. And the Secure Act said, we really want to make it safer for the participant to have lifetime income. And one of the concerns that the plan sponsors had was, well, yeah, but if I pick an insurance company that goes out of business, then I'm going to be sued. And not only am I going to be sued, I'm going to be responsible for not having provided what I intended to provide. So Congress gave a safe harbor, and they said, if you comply with the following process, making sure that they're properly funded, that they're properly regulated by their state insurance commissioner, about 7 or 8 steps, then you are protected against being sued if that insurance company should ever fail to make a payment. So in the next 3 years, there's been a lot of movement to try to find ways to essentially DB-ify the DC plan. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about those, but the point is, hey, we have these DB plans. I'm sure you have people who occasionally say pension plans on the public sector are too rich, or why can't they have DC just like the private sector? Well, here's why. Right now, we've gone through the process over the last 20 or 30 years of having fewer and fewer and fewer corporate DB plans. And what has the world done? It said, oh my gosh, I guess we better figure out a way to provide lifetime income in the DC plans. So that's what's happening now. So you have about 10 years ago, United Technologies invented a way to have a target date fund that glides, instead of gliding into fixed income securities, it glides into annuity solutions. And it's a brilliant solution. It doesn't require the participant to take any action, and in the end, it gives them some significant guaranteed income. A lot of people in the industry thought that many other plan sponsors would adopt that kind of program, but they did not, and that's why the Secure Act was passed. Since the Secure Act passed, you have DIAs, which are deferred income annuities, where basically at age 65, you would take something like 25 or 30% of your assets and put them in a deferred income annuity that doesn't start paying usually until you're 80. But it'll pay about 8% on that 25%. So it can be a good deal. Some reasons that some people don't like it is if you die, that money's gone. But if you live to 100, you certainly did well in having that. And you can spend down your other assets as you wait until you get to be 80. So that's one. Another is the classic SPIA, single purchase, single premium income annuity, which would basically be at 65, you go and you buy an annuity. You lock away the money. You usually do not have access to it unless there's a penalty, but you have guaranteed income for life. You also have variable annuity solutions, and then there's also managed payouts. There are some people who think, I don't really want to take on the cost of a guarantee. I'd rather just pay down, let's say, the 4% rule a year. And some investment managers manage money in a way that is designed to give you that kind of payout. But the point is, there's a tremendous movement in the DC world to create what you already have in the DB world. Another important point between corporate plans and public plans is discount rates. And we talked about liability-driven investing and how the discount rate has such a huge impact on the increase and decrease in corporate liabilities, and why that is so important in share price and employee compensation and senior employee compensation. Public plans have had a discount rate that is frankly, probably too high, or it's come down in recent years. As you can see, it was as high as 8% about 10 years ago. Now the average is in the low 7s. It's a pretty interesting topic because politically, do you want to show how big your funding gap is? So politically, you might say, well, I don't know that we can project getting a 7 over the long run anyway. And when I use the 7 as the discount rate, my liabilities are $100 million. If I used a 6 as the discount rate, my liabilities would be $120 million. And that gap, that $20 million in underfunding, would expose the need to be funded. So not everybody wants to expose or talk about how big their gap is, but some people do, because the bigger the gap, hopefully the more you're going to be funded. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about funding in a minute. You'll see that corporate plans, they're on top. Their funded ratio has been nearly 100% in recent years. That's despite the fact that interest rates have been so low. Corporate plans have mitigated a lot of risk by going into LDI, and the public plans have decreased their discount rate by a bit, as I said, from maybe 8 to 7. But because of very, very strong markets, the funding ratio in public plans has gotten better. I think this slide shows that it's around 80. However, that was around the end of 2021. So anybody who was 80% funded at the end of 2021 is probably, you do the math, 70% funded, let's say, today, maybe even less. But remember, this comparison isn't really true, because the 80% funding ratio for public plans is based on a 7% discount rate, where the 100% funding ratio for corporate plans is based on about a 4% discount rate. So the 80% funding ratio for public plans, if they used corporate funding discount rates, would probably not be 80, would be about 50. And that's a very, very important challenge, because it reminds us how important it is that the public sector plan sponsors fund up. So as I talked about, corporate plans have different funding needs, right? They have the need to meet the IRS requirements, the need to meet the requirements of the Pension Protection Act and ERISA, and that's one of the reasons why their funding ratio is stronger. In the public sector, you're governed by GASB, as you know, and the GASB used to have something called the ARC, the Annual Required Contribution. Now I think it's called the Actuarially Determined Employer Contribution. Why they decided to switch from Annual Required Contribution to Actuarially Determined Employer Contribution, I think I can actually tell you. Because everybody realized that the word required in Annual Required Contribution was just a word. It wasn't required, right? Think how often public sector entities don't make the ARC. And that is, if you're going to argue to make the ARC, You want to remember all the things I said before about the power of pooling and the benefits and the comparative costs of DB plans, because that's your argument for why it's important to make the full arc. These numbers may or may not astound you. If you're in the public sector, you may know that frequently public sector entities don't make their full arc. But in the 4 years after the dot-com bubble, the missed contributions by public sector plans was $27 billion. Now that's $27 billion that would have been put in starting in 2003 through 2006. Think how much that could have generated in the market that we've had in place since then. And after the global financial crisis from 2011 to 2010 to 2013, the missed public sector ARC contributions was over $65 billion. So that's about $100 billion of ARC shortfall. And by the way, those numbers are nearly 10 years old. So think how much in assets that would have generated. Think how much in funding that would have generated. And it's an important point because as you oversee investment teams, you know, journalists and politicians will come up to the pension plan and say, how come you're underfunded? How come you're only 70% funded? What's the matter? What are you doing wrong? And you want to say, the reason that we're underfunded is that we're underfunded. Right? It's not because if we got a 6.7% return and we had an estimated return of 7.1, yes, it would have been better to hit 7.1. It would have been even better to hit 7.3. But the fact of the matter is the reason we have really significant underfunding is because the legislatures and governors need to make the full contribution, need to make the ARC, because the reason for underfunding is not investment performance, it's because of underfunding. One last point just that I thought would be of some interest is the difference in inflation's impact on corporate plans and public plans. Obviously, the discount rate is likely to go up as inflation goes up, so that's a benefit, if you want to call it that, for the corporate plan, right? As discount rates go up, their liabilities, their measured liabilities go down, and their funding obligations in the near term also go down. Public plans, because you use fixed discount rate, don't get that benefit, if it's a benefit at all, because it's going to come back the other way, and sometimes having a fixed rate means that when things, you know, when interest rates are going up, you don't get the change in liabilities that would change the impact of your funding obligations. So fixed rates can be a benefit at times, especially if you want to have a long-term investment policy. The calculation of future wages is going to affect both corporate plans and public plans in a similar way. COLAs don't usually exist in corporate plans. Now, you all probably have some version of COLAs. Interestingly, they're not usually in the public sector going to match inflation. So if inflation is 8, I think in most cases the employee's COLA might go up 2 or 3%, but nonetheless that's a different impact than the corporate plans. The last point I wanted to make, which I don't have slides for, is about governance and politics, and not partisan politics, but a different kind of politics. And I'm going to tell you a story about when I was at the PBGC. When I got to the PBGC, and the point is, the structure of the PBGC is governed in a political framework that makes it very difficult for the staff to make the right kinds of decisions. So when I got there, the PBGC had a deficit of about $25 billion. It was about 75% funded. And my first day on the job, I was in a meeting with the senior staff, maybe about 12 people, and I said, so what's our plan for getting out of the deficit? And everybody kind of squirmed. I said, do we have a plan? And everybody kind of squirmed a little bit more. And I finally said, is there no plan? And somebody said, well, we think that's Congress's problem. And by the way, the investment policy at the time was very much about LDI. It was 75% fixed income. So there was no realistic way at 75% fixed income that we were going to use our investments to close that gap. And unlike a public plan, we didn't have any source of funding. We don't have the PBGC doesn't have a plan sponsor. And unlike a corporate plan, we don't have a stock price. The only thing that we really had was assets, and we weren't putting them to work. We were like the guy in the gospel story where the master gives 5 talents to one guy and 2 talents to another and 1 talent to the last guy. And when he comes back, the first guy's doubled it and he goes, great, you're gonna get promoted, you get all kinds of good things. The second guy, he doubled it, he goes, great, you're gonna get promoted, you get all kinds of good things. And the third guy says, I was scared I'd lose it, so I didn't do anything. Here, you can have it back. And the master sends him off to oblivion because he didn't use the talents and the gifts that he had been given to increase. Well, here we are with $60 billion, with 50% or 45 billion of it in fixed income, with no even effort to close the gap. So they said, well, we think that's Congress's problem. And I said, well, that's interesting, because ERISA, the law that created the PBGC, says expressly that the United States government does not stand behind the liabilities of the PBGC. Now that's kind of a shock when you become the head of the PBGC, and in your preparation for your Senate confirmation hearing, somebody gives you a practice question. The practice question was, well, Mr. Millard, as you know, ERISA expressly states that the United States government doesn't stand behind the liabilities of the PBGC. Who does? And you're sitting there thinking, I hope there's somebody standing behind me, because it ain't gonna be me. And there's no real answer to that question. Coincidentally, since then, there has been a bailout of multi-employer plans by the US government. So the fact that Congress would likely have acted, was a reasonable thing to think, but it was also quite clear that our charge was to make the most out of the assets that we had and to assume the government would not be there to bail us out. So I said, well, we need to change our investment policy and take some more risk. So we went through a year-long process, and we came out with something that was 45% fixed income, 45% equities, 5% real estate, and 5% private equity. Compared to many public sector plans, still actually relatively conservative. However, we adopted it in February of 2008, and we began to implement it in December of 2008, because it took that long to get everything ready. Well, if you remember what it was like in December of 2008, it was the global financial crisis, it was post-Lehman Brothers, it was General Motors was in government bailout situation. The world was on fire. And I said, look, we're supposed to be in set of risks and opportunities X. We are currently in set of risks and opportunities Y. We're not supposed to time the market. We are going to leg in. We're going to go month by month as planned. So it'll be like dollar cost averaging, but we should still do that. Well, that's fine, except I left office when your former governor, George W. Bush, left office in January of 2009. So the PBGC is governed by 3 cabinet secretaries and the director. So the 3 cabinet secretaries that come in, they're not invested in this new policy. They didn't vote for this new policy. They know the world is on fire. And they just got named Secretary of Treasury, Commerce, and Labor, and they barely know what the PBGC is. That's collateral duty for them. So they have board reps, but the board reps are usually assistant secretaries. Well, the assistant secretary hasn't been named yet, so there's some acting assistant secretary who doesn't intend to stay in this job, who has to decide while the Secretary of Treasury's getting confirmed, what are we going to do are we going to do the next leg into the PBGC's investment policy? Are we going to be buying equities instead of fixed income while the world is on fire? So of course, it's the spring of 2009. If you remember when the market hit bottom, was around the spring of 2009, they decided, let's just freeze it. Let's not do anything. We're not going to reject it. We're not going to vote it out. We're not going to buy more fixed income. But let's just freeze it. And it took them about a year before they unfroze it, and it probably cost them $20 billion. Now that was not because the Obama people hated the Bush people or the Republicans and the Democrats had different views of pension risk. It was because the governance structure of the PBGC didn't really allow the investment staff to have the nimbleness that it needed and it cost the PBGC about $20 billion. So I hope that's a useful lesson. So one more point about my family. I mentioned in the beginning my son Egan. My parents recently had their 60th wedding anniversary, and we had a big party with all the kids and grandchildren and a few great-grandchildren. And one of my cousins made a beautiful toast about the legacy of their love and the example that they had set and the beauty of having our family together. And my father reached over to my mother and he tapped her on the knee and he said, "I'm very proud of you." And she looked at him with that squint when you sometimes didn't quite hear what the person said. And she said, "I'm tired of you too." Well, I don't want you to be tired of me, so I'll leave it at that and take some questions. Any questions or comments? Yes?
One comment, well, two. Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate the comparison of public plans in the ERISA world. There was one chart, I think it was page 15, where you compared the funding ratios of public plans to ERISA plans, and the ERISA plans had the higher funding ratios. I would just point out that those funding ratios of ERISA plans are based on accrued benefits, whereas the public plans funded ratio are based on projected benefits. So that's another reason for the disparity.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's the complex news is there's lots of different actuarial provisions that change apples to oranges when you thought you had two sets of apples in the first place. I would say being on top of whether somebody is playing an actuarial game is a really, really important point. I talked to the CIO of a major state, not Texas, who said the games they play on the staff, the actuarial games they play on the staff, cost me about $2 billion a year. They should be putting $2 billion more in than they are because they play those kinds of games. So thanks for that point. Yes?
So Charles, as head of the PBGC, how are you finding interesting stories from the time of government?
Any funny or interesting stories from the time of government? Wow. Is this a public forum? I'll tell you, well, first of all, a little tidbit. You probably all know this, but it's worth remembering. Every president gets a public sector pension, so they're in the same boat. So I don't know where to take that point, but I thought it was interesting. I looked it up before I came. Interestingly, Donald Trump also has a Screen Actors Guild pension because when he did The Apprentice, he had to sign up for their benefits. I'll tell you two stories. One is about how people make you feel. So I was in New York. I was trying to sell a building that the city owned, and Donald Trump was the person who wanted to buy it. Was one of the people who wanted to buy it. And at that point, he was, a bombastic and famous real estate developer, but he wasn't the Donald Trump of today. And I'm probably 38. I'm pretty young in the job, and he's Donald Trump. He's a big name. And at the end of the meeting, and his whole meeting was, "This is spectacular. It's going to be the greatest. It's terrific." And then he stops at the end of the meeting and he goes, "And you tell the mayor, you're doing a great job. You tell him I think Charles Millard's doing a great job." And for about 5 seconds, I thought, wow, I'm doing a great job. And then I remembered, wait, this is Donald Trump. I mean, he's more a politician than I am. The other experience I had, which was not in government, was I spent some time, I was working for a company where one of our CEO was one of Biden's big fundraisers in the 2008 time period. And he said, "Hey, you like politics, come on in, come and spend some time with us." So it was me and Biden and our CEO. And Biden knew that I had worked in New York City during the Giuliani administration, which had reduced crime so much and increased economic development a lot, and had responded pretty heroically after 9/11. So he had a pretty positive view at the time. And you think that a politician's job is to make you feel good about him, right? That he's supposed to make you feel like he's a great guy. Joe Biden made me feel like I was a great guy. I mean, I left that meeting thinking Charles Millard is one heck of a guy. And I had to stop and remind myself, hey, he's a politician and you disagree with him, you're in the other party. But for the 10 seconds as I walked down the hall, I was floating on air. And that's a pretty significant gift for a politician. I guess one other about leadership. So Rudy Giuliani, as mayor of New York, was a tremendous leader. Obviously, he's become very controversial now, so my comments are about the time when I was dealing with him in the past. He had two different kinds of leadership styles. You probably have all gone to off-sites where you talk about leadership and consensus and framing the issue and listening to other people's points of view and getting consensus and all that kind of thing. Rudy Giuliani led in two ways that I'm going to mention, well, three. He set an agenda and he drew the lines and you knew where you were headed very clearly. That's number one. Number two, he used fear. And that's not something you get in your off-sites where we're holding hands and saying kumbaya, but he was a guy you did not want to be on the wrong side of. And I remember one time I got quoted in the newspaper about a transaction that I hadn't gotten sign-off from City Hall yet. And the chief of staff calls me and he goes, the mayor wasn't very happy about seeing your name in the press today. So I didn't know if that meant he was mildly displeased or if they were scraping him off the ceiling, but for the next 48 hours, I was doing everything I could to make sure that I had pleased the mayor. But the other thing, and people don't talk about this as much, is loyalty. So my agency paid bonuses. We made money for the city, so we were allowed to pay bonuses. If you made $100,000, your bonus might be $10,000. So it's enough to matter. And in the world of public employees, when teachers are getting paid 60 or 70 or 80, it's easy to criticize that. And of course, I got criticized. I got creamed. For a few days in the press, it was, Millard, is clueless. Millard has done terrible things. He's just just all the negative things you could imagine that might be said. So at the same time, we have a press conference to announce the sale of the United Nations Hotel. The city owned a hotel. No reason the city should own a hotel. One of the campaign promises was we would sell it. We finally did sell it, and we had the press conference. So everybody's, father to victory. So every commissioner who ever said the words United Nations Hotel is there for the press conference, including me. And this was one of those ones where I was the captain of the deal. A lot of times I was one of those extras, but this was one that I had really led. And usually the mayor would speak and go to the person who was the captain. So he goes to the person from the state who did nothing. He goes to the person from this other agency who kind of opposed it until they saw the writing on the wall. He's going through the whole thing, and he's not mentioning me. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, this was my thing. And I'm comforting myself with, well, you're not in this just for the glory, just be proud of what you did. And I'm a little upset. And then I saw him do something I had never seen him do. Because usually he takes the credit and then he lets the rest of the people speak. This time he said, but there's one other person without whom this transaction never would have been done. Charles Millard put this on the market, helped us take it off the market, helped us price it, decided when to put it back on the market, and without his leadership, the New York City taxpayers would not be $100 million richer today. So it took me a little while to think, why did he do that? It was his way of saying, you're going to criticize my guy? You think I'm going to be against him because he paid these bonuses? He's my guy, and I'm for him, and in your face, look at how I'm celebrating the guy who you're criticizing. So it might not surprise you to know where I was in January of 2008 when Rudy Giuliani was running for president in New Hampshire. I was up knocking on doors because the loyalty factor is something that's easy to overlook in politics and in life, but it's a pretty important part of leadership. So that was a long answer. I hope you liked the stories.